For 60 years, the world thought it knew Marilyn Monroe, the blonde bombshell, the tragic icon, the woman who smiled for the cameras while falling apart behind closed doors. But a letter, written in her own hand, hidden away for decades, has just resurfaced, and it is rewriting everything we thought we understood about her final years. This is not a rumor. This is not fan speculation. This is Marilyn Monroe's own words, describing events so disturbing that historians are calling it one of the most important discoveries in Hollywood history. What she wrote will change the way you see her forever. And by the end of this video, you will understand why people are saying the real story of Marilyn Monroe has never actually been told until now. Here is what we know. Buried inside a private archive of Monroe's diaries, poems, and personal letters is a document dated March 1st and 2nd, 1961. 6 pages, written by Marilyn herself, addressed to her psychoanalyst, Dr. Ralph Greenson. It is not a love letter. It is not a script note. It is a first-hand account of what she said was one of the most terrifying experiences of her life. And when journalist Sam Kashner examined this letter for Vanity Fair, he realized he was holding something extraordinary. Not just a piece of memorabilia, a confession, a record of pain that Marilyn Monroe never wanted the world to see. Before we go further, understand what this discovery means. For decades, the public image of Marilyn Monroe was carefully managed. Studios controlled her narrative, magazines shaped her persona, biographers filled in the blanks with speculation. But a letter written in her own handwriting cannot be spun by a studio publicist. It cannot be softened by a press agent. It is raw, unfiltered, and it comes directly from her. And what it reveals is a side of Marilyn Monroe that almost nobody was allowed to see while she was alive. The letter begins in a hospital, not a spa, not a retreat, a psychiatric ward. In February of 1961, Marilyn Monroe checked into New York's Payne Whitney Clinic, reportedly on the advice of her own psychiatrist, hoping for a place of rest. What she found instead, according to her own account, was something closer to a nightmare. She described a lack of compassion from the staff. She described being placed among severely disturbed patients in a locked unit with cement walls. She wrote that she felt like she was in a prison for a crime she never committed. Read that again. One of the most famous women on the planet, the biggest movie star of her generation, was locked behind a door with a small window, watched constantly, unable to leave. This is the moment that changes everything. Because for years, the public story of Marilyn Monroe's mental health struggles was told through other people, through biographers, through gossip columns, through Hollywood insiders speaking secondhand. Now, for the first time, we have her own account, in her own words, of what that period of her life actually felt like. And it is far darker than anything the studios ever allowed to leak. According to the letter, Monroe grew desperate enough inside that facility that she threatened self-harm using broken glass if the staff would not release her. Think about the level of fear and desperation required for a global icon to reach that point, alone behind locked doors, with no one from her glamorous world there to help her. The letter suggests she felt abandoned in that moment, trapped by a system that was supposed to protect her, but instead made her feel like a prisoner. And here is where the story takes its most unexpected turn. The person who reportedly came to her rescue was not a studio executive. It was not a director. It was her ex-husband, baseball legend Joe DiMaggio. According to the letter and the records surrounding it, DiMaggio flew in and pushed back against the doctors and nurses who wanted to keep her there, and personally removed her from the ward. This was a man she had already divorced years earlier, a man whose marriage to her had famously and publicly fallen apart. Yet, when she needed someone the most, when the world she had built around herself had failed her, it was DiMaggio who showed up. That detail alone has reignited a decades-old conversation. Was Joe DiMaggio the one person in Marilyn Monroe's life who genuinely loved her without an agenda? The letter reveals that the two had reconciled just months earlier that Christmas, and that DiMaggio had sent her flowers. Now historians are asking a haunting question. If DiMaggio was the one constant protective presence in her life during her most vulnerable moment, what does that say about everyone else surrounding her? What does that say about the people she trusted with her career, her image, and ultimately her safety? Because this letter does not stop at describing her hospitalization. It goes further, into territory that has stunned even longtime Monroe historians. Woven into the broader archive of diaries and notes recovered alongside this letter are Monroe's private reflections on the men in her orbit during the final chapter of her life. One name keeps surfacing: Peter Lawford, actor, socialite, and brother-in-law to President John F. Kennedy. According to notes found in this same collection, Monroe wrote about a feeling of violence connected to Lawford, expressing fear that he might harm her in some way. This was not a passing comment. This was written down, preserved, and now uncovered decades later. Let that sink in. Peter Lawford was one of the last people known to have spoken to Marilyn Monroe by phone before she was found dead in August of 1962. For 60 years, his role in her final hours has been the subject of endless documentaries, books, and conspiracy theories. Now we have evidence, in her own handwriting, that she did not fully trust him, that she feared him, that somewhere in the back of her mind she suspected he could be dangerous to her. This single detail has reopened questions that many assumed were buried forever, and it does not end there. The same archive reveals Monroe's private feelings about her third husband, playwright Arthur Miller. Publicly, their marriage was framed as an intellectual romance, the sex symbol and the serious writer finding unlikely common ground. But privately, according to these newly surfaced documents, Monroe felt betrayed by Miller in ways she rarely discussed on the record. The details paint a picture of a woman who was constantly performing stability for the outside world while quietly unraveling in private, surrounded by people she was not sure she could trust. So why does this matter right now? Why is a letter from 1961 suddenly dominating conversations in 2026? Because the timing could not be more significant. This year marks 100 years since Marilyn Monroe's birth, and with that centennial has come a wave of renewed attention, museum exhibitions, and major auctions putting her most personal possessions on public display for the first time. Auction houses have recently unveiled entire collections of her letters, notes, and diary pages, pulled from the archives of people who were closest to her, including her friends Norman and Hedda Roston. Item after item is surfacing that was never meant for public eyes. This is not a coincidence. This is a full-scale re-examination of who Marilyn Monroe actually was, happening in real time, right in front of us. And the emotional core of that re-examination is this letter to Dr. Greenson, because it strips away every layer of glamour and shows us a woman in genuine crisis, writing not for an audience, not for a magazine cover, but simply trying to survive one of the worst moments of her life. The reaction from historians has been intense. Long-time Monroe biographers are calling this one of the most significant primary sources to emerge in decades, because it does not rely on second-hand accounts or studio-approved narratives. It is Monroe explaining, in real time, what she endured. Psychologists who have reviewed the letter's contents point out how strikingly self-aware she was about her own suffering, even while trapped inside a system that treated her as just another patient, rather than a human being in crisis. That level of clarity, they argue, complicates the old, simplistic image of Monroe as merely fragile or unstable. She was observant. She was articulate. She understood exactly what was happening to her. And she wrote it down so that someone, someday, would know the truth. Fans online have reacted with a mixture of heartbreak and anger. Heartbreak, because the letter confirms just how alone Monroe felt during a period when the entire world believed she had everything. Anger, because it raises uncomfortable questions about the people who were supposed to protect her and failed. Comment sections and forums have exploded with people revisiting old assumptions about her death in August of 1962, wondering aloud whether her fears about Lawford, her documented distrust of the people around her, and her repeated brushes with institutions that dismissed her pain were all connected threads in a much larger and darker story than the public was ever told. That is the political and cultural weight this discovery now carries. Marilyn Monroe was not just a movie star, she was connected, through Lawford, directly into the Kennedy family orbit during one of the most turbulent periods in American political history. Any new detail that touches that connection, especially one involving fear and distrust written in her own hand, does not stay contained to entertainment news. It bleeds into decades of political conspiracy theories about her death, about her relationship with the Kennedys, and about who really knew what in the days before she died. Expect this letter to be cited in future documentaries, congressional retrospectives on the era, and renewed calls from researchers for full transparency on any remaining sealed records connected to her final months. There is also a deeper consequence to this discovery, one that goes beyond gossip or conspiracy. It forces a reckoning with how the entertainment industry treated mental health in that era. Marilyn Monroe was arguably the most famous woman alive when she wrote this letter, and she still could not get compassionate care. She still ended up locked in a ward, threatening self-harm just to be heard. If that could happen to her, at the absolute peak of global fame, What does it say about how anyone else struggling in that era was treated? Mental health advocates are already pointing to this letter as a haunting historical example of institutional failure, one that feels disturbingly relevant even now, decades later. Meanwhile, the auction and archival world is moving fast. Collections containing letters between Monroe and DiMaggio, love notes from Miller, and personal reflections from friends like the Rostons have already drawn massive bidding interest, with individual pieces estimated at tens of thousands of dollars and full collections potentially reaching into the millions. Every new item that surfaces adds another fragment to the puzzle, and researchers are racing to cross-reference these newly available documents against existing biographies to see how many long-accepted facts about Monroe's life may need to be corrected. So what happens next? Historians expect more documents from this same archive to be examined and potentially published in the coming months, as researchers work through diaries, poems, and letters that have remained privately held for over 60 years. There is growing pressure on institutions and private collectors holding additional Monroe materials to make them available for scholarly review, especially given how much this single letter has already reshaped public understanding. Expect new books, new documentary specials, and renewed media scrutiny of everyone who was close to Monroe in her final year, particularly anyone connected to that fateful call from Peter Lawford on the night she died. There is also the question of legacy. For 60 years, the world has been fed a version of Marilyn Monroe shaped mostly by others, by studios eager to protect their investment, by biographers filling gaps with theory, and by tabloids chasing sensational angles. This letter changes that dynamic permanently because it hands the narrative back to her. It lets Marilyn Monroe speak for herself, in her own words about her own pain. And what she describes is not the version of the story most people grew up believing. She is not simply the tragic blonde who couldn't handle fame. She is a woman who clearly saw the danger around her, named the people she distrusted, described the institutions that failed her, and somehow still managed to survive it all until that final, mysterious night in August of 1962. That is why this discovery has struck such a nerve. It is not just a historical curiosity for collectors and biographers. It fundamentally challenges the myth of Marilyn Monroe as a passive victim of circumstance and replaces it with the image of a sharp, self-aware woman fighting to be understood in a world that refused to actually listen. Every detail in this letter adds weight to a growing belief among historians that the full truth about her final years, her relationships, and possibly even her death has still never been completely told. As more of this archive comes to light, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The Marilyn Monroe the world thought it knew was, in many ways, a carefully constructed illusion. And the real woman, the one who wrote these desperate, honest, unfiltered pages from inside a locked psychiatric ward, may finally be coming into focus, 60 years after her death, one letter at a time. This story is far from over. New documents are expected to surface, more archives are being opened for review, and the questions this letter has raised about Peter Lawford, about her final months, and about who truly knew the real Marilyn Monroe are only getting louder. Stay tuned, because the next discovery could change everything all over again.